Every Farthing Publications presents Abuse.
When is abuse abuse? Abuse is the word of the day. We all love to find a situation or an example where somebody is abusing somebody else or some group. And certainly there's enough people mistreating each other in various groups and so on that we have a lot of opportunity for that kind of moral indignation. The other thing that people are very much into is being a survivor of abuse. It seems like you really aren't anybody if you're not a survivor of some sort of horrific abuse. That's what many people find gives their lives meaning and dignity. So I guess there's some positive outcomes for abuse, if you look at it from that point of view. In any case, the term usually brings to mind the sexual abuse of minors. So that's what I'd like to focus on at this point. I'm going to need to read a couple of examples because we need to really see exactly what we're talking about in some sort of concrete way. And I know reading isn't the best way to present something, but obviously I don't have these memorized, and for the sake of accuracy, I'll read them. So bear with me. I think you'll find them rather interesting. The first one is by Ingmar Bergman. It was in his autobiography. And he's describing an incident that occurred when he was visiting an aunt that he had. He describes her as a large, masculine sort of woman who was not especially attractive, but he liked her and enjoyed staying at her house from time to time. And he says, "One evening I was to have a bath. The maid filled the bath and poured into it something that smelt good. I got into the hot water and dozed with pleasure. My aunt knocked on the door and asked if I had fallen asleep. When I did not answer, she came in. She was wearing a green bathrobe which she took off. She told me she was going to scrub my back. I turned over and she got into the bath, soaped me and scrubbed me with a stiff brush, then rinsed me with her soft hands. Then she took my hand, drew it toward her, and pulled it between her thighs. The pulse in my neck throbbed, and she parted my fingers and pressed them further toward her loins. She enclosed my penis in her other hand, and it reacted astonishingly and vigorously. She carefully pulled back my foreskin and poked away a mass of white stuff that had collected around my penis. All this was most pleasurable and not in the least frightening. She held me firmly between her strong, soft thighs and let me be rocked without resistance or fear into a weighty, almost painful enjoyment. I was perhaps 8 or 9. My aunt and I often met at home at the parsonage, but the matter was never mentioned." So that's one example of abuse, but certainly that's not typical because that's not what the term normally brings to mind. In the first place, it's a woman rather than a man doing the, quote, abusing. And the second thing is that he really enjoyed it a lot, apparently, from his description. So let's see if we can find another more typical example. Here's one by Heinz Kohut. He's the founder of self-psychology, a very well-known psychologist in the field. And he describes an incident when he was a boy and was abused. He said, "I had this private tutor who was a very important person in my life. He would take me to museums and swimming and concerts, and we had endless intellectual conversations and played complicated intellectual games and played chess together." And that's Heinz Kohut's words. The author of his biography then goes on to say, "They also did sexual things together, which they both enjoyed. But Kohut felt the sex was more or less incidental. The important thing for him was the relationship. He said, quote, 'I was an only child, so it was in some way psychologically life-saving for me. I was very fond of the fellow," unquote. Heinz was about 10 or 11 at the time. He describes his years with the tutor as perhaps the happiest in his life. Well, that's a little more typical because it's a man doing the abusing, but generally speaking, when people come up with abuse, sexual abuse, they don't mean something that was the most wonderful thing in a boy's life, at least according to his recollection. So let's try again here. I've got a couple of others. Maybe famous people like Heinz Kohut and Bergman have better luck than the rest of us. Their abuse is more pleasurable. But here's two other examples. They're taken from a book that you can find on my on the You Are Your Story site. Here's one of them. "Joss was a father, friend, and brother for me, all at the same time. Joss never went too far. If there was something I did not want, he stopped immediately. The love this man gave me, the feeling of being loved, was such an overwhelming, beautiful thing." Another atypical example, undoubtedly. And yet, Titus Rivas, whose book I mentioned is being available on You Are Your Story, has dozens and dozens of such examples. Here's another one. "A student at the University of Stockholm wishes to be known as Sven Svambruth. He is 23 years old and active in politics and gay emancipation. A psychologist, Tim Rolson, asked him some questions about a relationship with an adult man he had as a teenage boy at the age of 14. And the student who's being interviewed says, quote, "To be frank, I had the feeling that I was the dominant party within the relationship. He did nothing if I did not show the initiative," unquote. And then he also says in the interview, "In my view, there weren't any negative sides to the relationship. The only thing I didn't like was the secrecy. Many people find relationships of teenagers with adult men disgusting." And of course they do. Probably a lot of people watching this interview feel that way about it. But then he says, "The relationship helped me a lot in my intellectual and sexual development, so much that I would do it all over again." So apparently he did not find it particularly disgusting himself. So what are we to say about this? It's a difficult thing. So I began this little talk with the question, when is abuse abuse? And I just want to leave it with a question rather than an answer. Is abuse abuse even when it is experienced as love, as discovery, and as pleasure? That's what I leave you to think about.